August 15, 1944. A quiet street in San Diego. The morning sun filters through the curtains of a small bungalow. A woman stands at the kitchen sink, washing dishes, her hands moving in slow, practiced circles. The knock comes softly at first, then again louder. She dries her hands on her apron and walks to the door. A Western Union messenger, no older than 17, stands on the porch holding a yellow envelope. He doesn't meet her eyes. She takes it, thanks him quietly, and closes the door. Her fingers tremble as she tears the seal. The words are typed in clean, impersonal capitals. Regret to inform you, USS Flier, SS, 250, overdue and presumed lost. Stop your husband, Lieutenant James Little, missing in action. Stop letter to follow. The telegram slips from her hand and drifts to the floor. But she doesn't collapse. She doesn't scream. She stands perfectly still, staring at the wall, and then she says it aloud to the empty room. No, not him. Not yet. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had become a grinding, brutal contest of endurance. American submarines prowled the waters between Japan and its occupied territories, hunting convoys, severing supply lines, choking the empire from within. It was a silent war fought in darkness and depth, where men lived for weeks inside steel tubes, breathing recycled air, listening to the groan of the hull under pressure, waiting for the sound of a torpedo launch or the explosion that would end everything. The submarines of the United States Navy were some of the most advanced machines of their time, but they were also coffins in waiting. 1 in 5 never came home. The USS Flier was a Gato-class submarine, commissioned in October 1943. She was sleek, fast, and deadly, armed with 10 torpedo tubes and a crew of 86 men. Her first war patrol had been successful. She had sunk enemy ships, evaded depth charges, and returned to port with her crew intact. Her second patrol had been quieter, less eventful, but no less tense. Submarine warfare was a game of patience and nerve, where success was measured not just in kills, but in survival. By August 1944, the Flier was preparing for her third patrol. The crew was a mix of seasoned veterans and fresh recruits, men who had learned to trust each other in the cramped, sweat-soaked compartments of the boat. They knew the risks. They knew the odds. But they also knew the mission. Japan was losing the war, but it was far from defeated, and every convoy that reached its ports prolonged the conflict. The Flier's orders were simple. Proceed to the Balabac Strait, a narrow passage between the Philippines and Borneo, and intercept Japanese shipping. It was a hunting ground, but it was also a graveyard. The strait was shallow, mined, and heavily patrolled. Submarines that entered it did so with the knowledge that escape routes were limited and the enemy was close. On August 2, 1944, the Flier departed from Fremantle, Australia. The mood aboard was tense but focused. The men wrote letters home before they left, as they always did. Letters that might never be read. Words that might be the last their families ever heard. Lieutenant James Little, the boat's executive officer, had written to his wife, Gertrude, a short note filled with the mundane details of daily life and a promise to see her soon. He had kissed the envelope before sealing it, a small ritual he had performed before every patrol. Gertrude had received the letter a week later. She had read it 3 times, memorizing every line, and then tucked it into the drawer of her nightstand. She did not know it would be the last letter she would receive for a very long time. The families of submariners lived in a strange, suspended state of existence. Their husbands, fathers, and sons disappeared for months at a time, swallowed by the ocean, and all they could do was wait. There were no phone calls, no updates, no news. Silence was normal. Silence was expected. But silence could also mean death, and the line between the two was impossibly thin. When a submarine was declared overdue, the Navy sent telegrams. The word missing was chosen carefully. It was not killed or lost or dead. It was missing, a word that left room for hope, but also for agony. Some families clung to that hope. Others accepted the reality immediately. There was no right way to grieve for someone who might still be alive. Gertrude Liddell was 32 years old in the summer of 1944. She had met James at a dance in San Diego in 1940, before the war, before everything changed. He had been a junior officer then, eager and idealistic, and she had been drawn to his quiet confidence, his steady hands, the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. They had married 6 months later in a small ceremony, attended by family and a handful of friends. The war had come, and James had volunteered for submarine duty. She had begged him not to. He had promised her he would be careful. It was a promise neither of them believed, but it was the only one they had. For 3 years, she had lived with the fear. Every knock on the door made her heart stop. Every telegram from the Navy sent a spike of cold terror through her chest. But James had always come home. Until now. When the telegram arrived on August 15th, she read it twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change the words. The Navy had declared the Flier overdue on August 13th. That meant the boat had missed its scheduled communication window. It meant something had gone wrong. The official letter arrived 2 days later. It was formal, distant, written in the passive voice of bureaucracy. The submarine had failed to report. Search efforts were being conducted. Families would be notified of any developments. There was a paragraph near the end about death benefits and survivor support. Gertrude folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen table. She did not cry. She did not call her mother or her sister. She simply sat in the silence of her home and made a decision. She would not accept this. Not yet. Not until she had proof. The word missing carried different meanings depending on where you stood. For the Navy, it was a bureaucratic designation, a procedural step in the machinery of war. A submarine was considered overdue after a certain number of days without contact. After that, it was presumed lost. The crew was declared missing in action. Families were notified. Benefits were processed. The system moved forward because it had to. There were thousands of men at sea. Thousands of families waiting for news, and the Navy could not afford to leave cases unresolved indefinitely. But for the families, missing was a word without closure. It was a door left open, a question without an answer. It meant that somewhere in the vast Pacific, their loved ones might still be alive, clinging to wreckage, waiting for rescue. Or it meant they were already gone, their bodies lost to the deep, and no one would ever know exactly when or how they died. It was a cruel limbo, and it could last for months. For the men aboard the Flier, the word missing did not exist. There was only survival or death, and in the first minutes after the explosion, survival seemed almost impossible. On the night of August 13, 1944, the USS Flier was transiting the Balabac Strait on the surface, running on diesel engines to recharge her batteries. The night was dark, moonless, and the sea was calm. The watch crew scanned the horizon for enemy vessels, but the strait was empty. At 10:00 p.m., there was no warning. The submarine struck a mine. The explosion ripped through the forward section of the boat with the force of a freight train. The bow crumpled inward, and seawater flooded the compartments in seconds. Men were thrown from their bunks. Alarms screamed. The lights went out. In the engine room, the crew felt the deck lurch beneath them. In the control room, the diving officer shouted for an emergency blow, trying to force air into the ballast tanks to keep the boat on the surface. But it was too late. The Flier was going down. Lieutenant James Liddell was in the conning tower when the mine detonated. The blast knocked him off his feet, and he hit his head against the steel bulkhead. Blood ran into his eyes, his ears rang. He heard voices shouting, but they sounded distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. He pulled himself upright and looked around. The conning tower hatch was open. Men were already climbing out onto the deck. He followed them. On the surface, chaos reigned. The Flier was sinking fast, her bow already submerged, her stern rising out of the water at a steep angle. Men scrambled to launch life rafts, but there was no time. The boat was going under in less than a minute. Some jumped into the water. Others clung to the deck railing, unwilling to let go until the last possible second. James Little pulled himself onto the sloping deck and saw the ocean rushing toward him. He took a breath and jumped. The water was warm, almost pleasant, but the impact drove the air from his lungs. He surfaced, gasping, and looked back at the submarine. The Flier's stern hung in the air for a moment, propellers spinning uselessly, and then she slid beneath the waves. The suction pulled men under. Some resurfaced, others did not. In the darkness, voices called out to each other, trying to stay together, trying to count how many had made it off the boat. 8 men. Out of 86, only 8 had survived. They clung to pieces of debris, life jackets, anything that floated. The nearest land was an island in the Philippine archipelago, miles away. The current was strong. The night was endless. James Little floated on his back, staring up at the stars, and wondered if Gertrude had received the telegram yet. He wondered if she believed he was dead. He wondered if he would ever see her again. Back in San Diego, Gertrude Little was refusing to sign the death benefit paperwork. The Navy had sent a representative to her home, a young officer in a crisp uniform who explained, gently but firmly, that the submarine had been missing for 2 weeks. No contact, no debris, no survivors. It was time to accept reality. She had looked at him with cold, steady eyes and said no. The officer had been taken aback. He explained that the benefits would help her financially, that it was in her best interest to process the claim. She repeated herself. No, not until she had proof. The officer left, frustrated and unsure of what to do next. He filed a report. Gertrude filed letters. She wrote to the Navy Department, to the Submarine Command, to anyone who might listen. She demanded answers. She demanded a search. She was told, politely, that searches had been conducted. The area was hostile. The risks were too great. The Flier was gone. But Gertrude did not accept this. She contacted other submarine wives, women who had lost their husbands, women who understood the grinding uncertainty of waiting. Some supported her. Others thought she was prolonging her own suffering. But she did not stop. She wrote to her congressman. She wrote to the Secretary of the Navy. She used every connection, every favor, every ounce of stubborn will she possessed. And slowly, against all odds, someone began to listen. In early September 1944, a Navy captain named Robert Davis received a stack of letters on his desk. They were all from the same woman, Gertrude Little, wife of a missing officer from the USS Flier. Davis had seen letters like this before, families desperate for answers, unwilling to let go, clinging to hope long after it was reasonable to do so. He usually passed them to an aide to draft a polite, final response. But something about these letters made him pause. They were not hysterical. They were not pleading. They were logical, methodical, and relentless. She cited previous submarine rescues, cases where men had been found weeks after their boats went down. She pointed out that the search area had been limited, that weather conditions had been poor, that the Navy had written off crews before, only to find them alive later. She argued that her husband and his crew deserved more than a cursory search and a telegram. Davis read the letters twice. Then he made a phone call. He contacted the commander of a patrol squadron operating near the Philippines. He asked if there were any resources available for a secondary search mission in the Balabac Strait area. The commander was skeptical. The strait was dangerous. The Japanese controlled the region. The chances of finding survivors after 3 weeks were nearly zero. But Davis pressed. He did not mention the letters. He simply said that it was worth one more look. The commander agreed to authorize a single reconnaissance flight. On September 10, 1944, a Navy PBY Catalina flying boat took off from a base in the southern Philippines. The crew had been briefed on the mission. Search the waters near the last known position of the USS Flier, look for debris, look for survivors, and do not take unnecessary risks. The pilot, Lieutenant Harold Becker, had flown dozens of search and rescue missions. He did not expect to find anything. The ocean was vast. 3 weeks was a long time. Men did not survive that long without food, water, or shelter. But he flew the search pattern anyway, scanning the waves, looking for anything out of place. 2 hours into the flight, the co-pilot spotted something. A small island, heavily forested, with a narrow beach. And on that beach, a signal fire, smoke rising in a thin column against the blue sky. Becker banked the plane and circled lower. On the beach, he saw men, 8 of them, waving frantically, their clothes torn, their skin burned dark by the sun. He radioed back to base. Survivors found. Repeat, survivors found. Preparing for water landing. The PBY touched down on the water half a mile from the island. Becker and his crew launched a rubber raft and paddled toward the beach. The 8 men stumbled into the surf to meet them. They were skeletal, dehydrated, and exhausted, but they were alive. Lieutenant James Little was among them. He collapsed into the raft, unable to speak, tears streaming down his face. The crew pulled them aboard the aircraft and gave them water, small sips at first, then more as their bodies adjusted. They were wrapped in blankets. Their wounds were treated, and then, slowly, they began to tell their story. After the Flier sank, the 8 survivors had floated for hours in the dark, clinging to debris, waiting for dawn. When the sun rose, they saw land in the distance. They swam toward it, a grueling journey that took most of the day. By the time they reached the beach, they were barely conscious. The island was uninhabited, covered in dense jungle with no fresh water and no food. They survived on rainwater collected in leaves and coconuts pried open with rocks. They built a signal fire and kept it burning day and night, hoping that someone, anyone, would see it. For 17 days, no one came. They watched the sky for planes. They watched the sea for ships. They grew weaker. Some of them began to lose hope. But James Liddell refused to give up. He told the men that their families would not stop looking. He told them that someone would come. He believed it, even when he had no reason to. And he was right. On September 11, 1944, a telegram arrived at Gertrude Liddell's home in San Diego. It was not from the Navy. It was from a Red Cross liaison officer who had received word from the rescue squadron. It read, "Your husband, Lieutenant James Liddell, found alive, stop rescued from island near Philippines. Stop condition, stable, stop more information to follow." Gertrude read the telegram once. Then she sat down on the floor and wept. For 3 weeks, she had fought the Navy, fought the bureaucracy, fought the assumption that her husband was dead. She had refused to sign the paperwork. She had written the letters. She had demanded answers. And now, impossibly, she had been proven right. The Navy had found him. He was alive. 2 days later, she received a phone call. It was James. His voice was weak, hoarse, but it was him. He told her he loved her. He told her he was coming home. He told her that he had thought of her every day on that island, that the thought of seeing her again was what kept him alive. She could not speak. She could only listen, tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed against her mouth. When the call ended, she sat in silence for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called the Navy representative who had tried to make her sign the death benefits. She told him, calmly and clearly, that her husband was alive. And then she hung up. The 8 survivors of the USS Flier were transported to a naval hospital in the Philippines, where they spent 2 weeks recovering. They were severely malnourished, sunburned, and dehydrated, but they were alive. Doctors marveled at their resilience. Most men would not have survived 17 days on a deserted island with no supplies. But these men had training, discipline, and an unshakable will to live. They were interviewed by Navy intelligence officers who wanted to know every detail of the sinking. James Liddell and the others recounted the night of August 13th, the explosion, the chaos, the frantic moments as the Flier went down. They described the swim to the island, the days of waiting, the signal fire that saved their lives. The intelligence officers took notes. They filed reports, and then they asked the question that no one wanted to answer. What about the other 78 men? The survivors had no answers. The Flier had sunk in less than a minute. Most of the crew had been trapped below decks when the mine detonated. The forward compartments had flooded instantly. The men in the engine room had been cut off. There had been no time to evacuate, no time to react. The 8 men on the bridge had survived only because they were already on the surface when the explosion occurred. Everyone else had gone down with the boat. The Navy declared the 78 men killed in action. Families received new telegrams, this time with the word deceased. There were funerals, memorial services, flag-draped coffins that held no bodies. The Flier was officially stricken from the Naval Register. She was gone, another name on the long list of submarines lost in the Pacific War. But the story of her survivors became something else. It became proof that miracles could still happen, that hope was not always foolish, that sometimes, against all odds, men came home. James Little returned to the United States in October 1944. He was given a hero's welcome, though he did not feel like a hero. He had survived, but so many others had not. He thought of the men who had been trapped below decks, the men who had drowned in the dark, and he wondered why he had been spared. It was a question he would carry for the rest of his life. Gertrude met him at the dock in San Diego. She had waited for weeks, counting the days, barely sleeping, terrified that something would go wrong at the last minute. When she saw him step off the transport ship, thin and hollow-eyed but alive, she ran to him. They embraced in silence, holding each other as if they might disappear if they let go. He whispered her name over and over. She told him she had never stopped believing. In the months that followed, James was debriefed, reassigned, and eventually given shore duty. The Navy did not send him back to sea. He had been through enough. Gertrude never spoke publicly about the letters she had written, the calls she had made, the pressure she had applied. The Navy never officially acknowledged her role in the rescue mission. There was no medal, no commendation, no public recognition. But privately, quietly, the story spread. Other submarine wives heard what she had done. Some wrote to her, thanking her for refusing to give up, for proving that the system could be challenged. Others resented her, believing that she had been lucky, that her husband had survived while theirs had not. Gertrude did not respond to the letters. She had not fought for recognition. She had fought for her husband. And she had won. The Navy did make one quiet change in policy. After the Flier incident, search and rescue protocols for missing submarines were reviewed. The time window for declaring a boat overdue was extended slightly. More resources were allocated to search missions in contested waters. It was not a dramatic shift, but it was something. One woman's refusal to accept a telegram had reminded the Navy that behind every casualty report was a family, and that families deserved more than form letters and bureaucratic efficiency. James Little lived until 1989. He and Gertrude never spoke much about the war. He did not attend submarine reunions. He did not give interviews. But every year on August 13th, he would sit quietly in his study and think about the 78 men who had not made it off the Flier. He would say their names aloud, one by one, a private ritual of remembrance. And every year, Gertrude would sit with him in silence, holding his hand, grateful for every day they had been given. War is often remembered in grand narratives, in battles won and lost, in leaders and strategies and turning points that changed the course of history. But war is also made of smaller moments, quieter acts of courage that never make the headlines. It is made of the woman who refuses to sign a form, who writes letters until someone listens, who believes in the impossible because the alternative is unbearable. It is made of the men who cling to debris in the dark, who swim toward a distant island, who keep a fire burning for 17 days because they trust that someone, somewhere, is still looking. The USS Flier was one submarine among hundreds. Her loss was one tragedy among thousands. But her story endures because it reminds us that the line between missing and lost, between hope and despair, is thinner than we imagine. And sometimes, all it takes to cross that line is one person who refuses to accept the word missing as final. Gertrude Little did not save her husband alone. She did not rescue him from the island. But she saved the idea of him. She kept the search alive. She made the Navy look one more time. And because of that, 8 men came home. The Pacific War would rage for another year. More submarines would be lost. More telegrams would be sent. But after the Flier, every family that received the word missing knew that it was not always the end of the story. Sometimes it was just the beginning of a longer, harder fight. And sometimes, if you fought long enough, if you refused to let go, the impossible became real. The fire kept burning. Someone saw the smoke, and the missing came home.